My name is Reverend Dr. Jim Antal, and I am the Special Advisor on Climate Justice to the General Minister and President of the United Church of Christ. Prior to this role, I was also the head of the UCC in Massachusetts, where I oversaw about 400 congregations and had the opportunity to preach on climate change almost every Sunday in those congregations. I'm delighted to be back with the Temple of Understanding in their focus this year on food and food systems, and particularly sustainable food systems. And I just want to open by saying, I was a local pastor for 20 years. I became a vegetarian pescatarian 50 years ago. And in all the opportunities I've had to preach from a pulpit, I have never once preached on my being a vegetarian or a pescatarian. And frankly, as we look at each other and think about this really critical issue now, I can't honestly tell you why I didn't. But what I do want to tell you right now is that in my experience, houses of worship have paid altogether too little attention to sustainable food systems. We pay too little attention to the spiritual dimension of our eating, to the justice dimensions of food availability and potable water also, and to the emerging recognition that our relationship to and use of the land for agriculture and what we do with the food that we harvest is a major contributor to climate change. We need to be more supportive of local farming and recognize the spiritual or religious connection that all of us as people of faith have with that. And my hope is that in the ensuing dialogue that Mary Evelyn and I will have, that you'll get some ideas of what you and your congregation can do.
Thank you, Jim. It's such a pleasure to be with you. I feel we've known each other forever, and Gus Beth is our mutual friend. And I'm thrilled, of course, to be with the Temple of Understanding, feeling a long lineage back to Juliet Hollister and many meetings in New York, at the UN, at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, and so grateful to Allison Van Dyke for keeping this going in Juliet's legacy, and the work of Grove Harris, along with Allison and Susie and the team here. Thank you so much. I think this issue, of course, of food, hunger, sustainability, seeds, soil, sun, is crucial. And I'm thrilled that it's a focus of the Temple of Understanding and, of course, of this major UN conference on food. And I want to signal from the very beginning, as you know, there are many, many groups trying to weigh in, NGOs and various organizations, our students here at Yale who are keenly interested in food, and the Vatican. I'm on a small subcommittee of the Vatican's dicastery for sustainability and so on, and they are deeply concerned to weigh in on this notion of sustainable agriculture, on the side of small farmers, moving this from the direction of profit to people, the use of land, the use of pesticides, the use of water, all of these things that we know are degrading our planetary ecosystems and creating immense vulnerability, especially for hunger around the world. I also want to just say here at the beginning, spend a few moments to help us to reflect on food in different cultures and religions. I am at the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology here at Yale in the School of the Environment. And we've worked for many years on trying to activate the voices of the world's religions on issues of the environment and eco-justice and so on. And we're about to launch some massive open online classes in the fall, with each section of which will have something on food and water and animals and the views of the different world's religions. So I'd love to just begin by taking a step back and saying food for many religions is a sacrament. And that means a ritual. And it has a variety of expressions of this, right? And this is why I'm so delighted that Jim will come back to specific practices or what the Eucharist might mean in a Christian tradition. But I want to just say, as we know, if we go through Judaism, the Shabbat, the weekly food celebration, lighting of candles and special foods and so on, and as well the Seder. These are traditions which value food, which value the cycle of the seasons and the weekly cycle that place us, embed us in nature, in ecosystems, in the sources of our food. I've just mentioned the Eucharist, but all the sacraments in the Christian traditions, including baptism, have the valuing of water. How can we baptize with polluted water, Thomas Berry used to say? How can we have a Eucharist with genetically modified wheat or pesticide-induced wine? I mean, just think of it, of what this sense of the sacred that's being degraded all throughout these systems. So Eucharist, thanksgiving, that's what the name means. How extraordinary is that? And even at the end of life, that there's an anointing with oil. So taking these, the fruits of the earth, as the Eucharistic ceremony says, and offering them back to the natural world, which has given them to us. And of course, if we take indigenous traditions, that tremendous sense of gift, of reciprocity, of a gift economy, so that to hunt a deer or an animal means you are giving thanks even before you are taking that life. My husband, John, is deeply involved, as we both are, with indigenous peoples here in North America. And before every ceremony, that sense of thanksgiving for the birds, for the plants, for the ecosystems that give life and nurture. And we're recovering that sense, aren't we, of thanksgiving for food and what sustains us. Now, if we just take a step back, and then I'll give it back to Jim. If we look at the Asian religions, again, we have extraordinary views of food from very ancient cultures. The Vedic hymns talk about food as in the part of the whole cosmic system, and yet nourishing humans and sacrificed back to the gods. This whole cycle of food, nourishment, and the gods that give it to us. I've spent a lot of time in Japan over the years. That's my first area of study. And, all homes there have altars. They're Buddhist altars, but they're Confucian altars in their home. And every morning, the rice that's cooked for breakfast, some of that rice will be put before the altars for the ancestors, to feed the ancestors and so on. And this wonderful syncretism of Buddhism and Confucianism and Taoism across East Asia is a very rich sensibility, so that sense of offering food to ancestors is very widespread. And as well at temples, you can see in Kyoto and all across China, offerings of rice wine, sake, of fruits and vegetables, and so on, and of water and salt. So the notion is, not only do you offer this to your ancestors, but you offer it to the gods of nature and the gods of these traditions that have helped supply it. And Shinto, in particular, has this marvelous sense of putting forth food offerings. And yet I just want to bring forward that food is not wasted. The food that's offered there, especially for the ancestors, can be eaten by the families, can be eaten at the temples or shrines and so on, and is enjoyed. So let me just conclude this very brief survey, like a drone survey over these magnificent religions that need more illustration. But I think the sense of celebration for food is enormous. You can't imagine, right, any feast day that doesn't have food at its center. And as well, many of these traditions, not all, but many of them have the fasting from food so that one purifies oneself and comes back into alignment with the powers of nature that have helped generate this fecundity of life that feeds us physically, spiritually, mentally, physically, etc. So I just would say food as a source of life, gratitude, reciprocity, and blessing. All the traditions have this deep sense of blessing of food. So Jim, back over to you.
Well, I want to pick up on a few of the many, many, many excellent things that you said there, and really just speak from my own tradition, the Christian tradition. As you emphasized at the end of your comments, the connection between food and celebration is one that would be, I think, obvious to any person, regardless of whether they were religious. But in a religious context, it also, the celebration provides an opportunity for education as well. And so I thought of the sacraments, that, as you mentioned them, the Eucharist, which, as we know, is a time of thanksgiving. There's an opportunity there to help the congregation go a little deeper into their understanding of how fundamental food was and how fundamental the gathering at the table was for Jesus, and how vulnerable all of that is today as a consequence of agribusiness, as a consequence of climate change, as a consequence of food for profit, not for people. It's an opportunity. The sacrament becomes an opportunity for education. It's also true in baptism, as you alluded to. We need to and we could learn so much more about water, about how few people in the world have potable water, whereas we can access water for our baptismal font from just any faucet that we find. So again, the sacrament becomes an opportunity, not just for celebration, but also for education. And then the anointing at the end of life is still another opportunity in the context of families that are grieving, to recognize that their grief can be in solidarity with millions and really billions of people the world over who are grieving over the most fundamental things that we take for granted, food and potable water. That becomes another educational opportunity. So I just wanted to sort of unpack that a little bit from a Christian point of view. I'm obviously not a rabbi, but I think there could be a rabbinic embrace of that kind of thinking and translation, if you will, and education in a Jewish context, and so too in a Muslim context, and so forth.
Yes, I love it. Thank you for that wonderful complementarity there, Jim. And you mentioned your veganism or your vegetarianism, I should say, and I've been vegetarian actually since being in Japan in 73, 74. At that time, it was because the fish, rice, vegetable diet was pretty much all there was, and I ate that there. And then and there was almost no meat. But I gave up the fish over issues of sustainability of the fish. And occasionally I do, and I eat it when I'm served and so on. It was with Carl Safina, this amazing marine biologist last night, and he had fished that day and had fixed it for us. So, I think we need to be adaptable and flexible in certain ways, but we do know that what we're growing in the Amazon, the cutting down of the rainforest, the soybeans to supply beef, cattle, and so on, is truly out of alignment with where we need to be. And so in addition to food, I think we need to bring in the more than human world, the animal world, and what that means with diets that are exploding around the world with more and more meat, et cetera. And I think that he wanted to just say many young people are tremendous. Our students at Yale are very much interested in this vegetarianism and veganism and so on. And it is one pro-climate change active thing that one can do. And Jim's going to mention many more. And Pachauri, who was head of the IPCC report years ago, said, if you want to do one thing, just eat less meat. We know that that's the case. And we also know it's healthy. But this sense of factory farming of animals is almost beyond comprehension. And it comes from this worldview, right, that animals have no feelings, that they're not sentient beings. And so one thing I would just want to draw into our consciousness, that factory farming of animals is not sustainable. It's only happened in the last 40 years. I remember teaching at Bucknell when they started to give bovine hormone growth to the cows and so on. And that's, 30, 25 years ago. This has all happened in a very short period of time. And I think we can reverse this. We can reverse it. One of the most important actions for health of people and of planet. So, and let me just conclude here by saying I'd like to have the positive along with our challenges. And that is, and I think you share it too, I'm sure, that what is exploding is this tremendous sense of animal sentience, consciousness, as well as consciousness of plants, of trees, this huge literature of The Secret Life of Trees, How Forests Think, right? And on and on. And plant knowing. Robin Kimmerer is coming out with a book on that as well. But Amy Carl Safina, who I just mentioned we were with last night, has written these books Beyond Words, how animals communicate. And of course, Jane Goodall understood this years and years ago. So this sense of types of knowing, migrating knowledge of caribou, of salmon, of all kinds of birds across this continent of ours, this is drawing us back into the livingness of our Earth community and the sacredness of all life that we will be consuming in a sacrificial way, but a deep way of reverence for these living systems around us. So Jim, back over to you.
I just love the phrase you just uttered, the livingness.
Yeah.
I'd never heard that said before, Mary Evelyn. That's so beautiful.
Oh, good.
And so I want to make a few connections from what you've just said. This notion of animal sentience and as humans, our increased identification with animals, not just animals, but also trees, that should have an impact on our actions.
Yes.
And so as you connected it with your own dietary commitments, your own dietary witness, if you will, and I have also, and it seems like you and I were, as we have been for more recently, but even back in the 70s, we were sort of simpatico in that regard. Frances Moore LePay had a big influence on me then. Thank God for her witness. Mm-hmm. I just want to point out to our audience that 3 minutes ago, we heard Mary Evelyn talk about her personal dietary commitments. And you have heard me say a little bit about my personal dietary commitments. So if there are clergy out there who are somehow reluctant or think it inappropriate to provide that kind of testimony, yes, I'll use that word, provide that kind of testimony in the context of their leadership. Again, back to your point, Mary Evelyn, we need to pivot. Our whole society needs to pivot. I can imagine America consuming 50% less meat within 15 years, okay? If we're going to get there, then probably next week, there have to be a bunch of clergy who are going to say, you know what? I've not eaten meat for 2 years or 5 years, or when my daughter stopped eating meat, that really was uncomfortable for me until I really thought it through and I made some changes in my life. And so that can become part of what we talk about, because here's another parallel between our conversation today and climate change. And the parallel is the thing, if you listen to Katharine Hayhoe, the foremost climate scientist in America today, who is also an evangelical Christian, she will tell you the most important thing an individual can do is to talk about climate change. And that's just what you exemplified a moment ago, Mary Evelyn, is that you talked about diet as an expression of our honoring the sentience of other beings. So I just think it's an illustration for what pastors and other clergy can follow. Let me, if I can, go on a little bit, because in preparation for today, I sort of made a list of what clergy might be able to do on a practical basis with their congregations in order to increase their consciousness about supporting sustainable food systems. So one of them is what we just discussed, and that is talk about it from the pulpit on a regular basis, maybe at least once a month. I would say the same thing about climate change as well. But here's some other suggestions. You and your congregation could do a little inventory or a little evaluation of what is your community's relationship with food. Let me unpack that a little bit. You might want to begin with water and just say, where does the water in your community come from? If there are farms in your community, what are the sources for irrigation? How resilient is your community to severe storms, which are, of course, on the increase? You might also look at waste, not just water waste, gray water as it's sometimes called, but also sewage waste in your community. And you might keep in mind that the world wastes 1 billion tons of food each year. On average, that's 163 pounds of wasted food per year per person on the planet. So do a little inventory, a little evaluation of your particular community's relationship with food. You can also have your congregation read a book or an article that is pertinent to the issues that Mary Evelyn and I are talking about. One that I would suggest, I heard her interviewed on NPR, is Farming While Black. The author is just amazingly articulate, and it would have a transformative effect on any who read it. There's also a new report that's just come out by the Rockefeller Foundation. It's called The True Cost of Food, Measuring What Matters to Transform the U.S. Food System. This is an article that also might help your congregation to connect with the upcoming food conference that the United Nations will be undertaking this coming October. You could also watch a YouTube. There's a whole set of YouTubes that the Center for Earth Ethics at Union Theological School did entitled Faith Plus Food. And you could just Google that and it will come up. You might look at CSAs, community supported agricultures, in the area of your congregation. If you have one, I would suggest that your mission committee, or whatever you call it in your house of worship, that it make the offer to the congregation. Anyone who subscribes to that CSA, the mission committee will pay 10% of what that costs. So that will motivate more people to participate in the CSA, and then people in your congregation who are more well-to-do, they might say, listen, I'm going to make a specific donation in order to refill that rotating foundation, if you will, within your congregation. As I said before, it's really important what clergy speak about from the pulpit. And speaking once a month about systemic hunger issues and systemic food issues is something every clergy could and should be doing. And then this is a hard one. I'm starting to mess with congregations when I say this, but take a careful look at the food you make available in your congregation at your coffee hour and at other house of worship functions. and look at it relative to is it coming from sustainable food sources, and a whole checklist of other categories that I think would probably cause you to change your house of worship diet, if you will. And then finally, something that happened in Massachusetts when I was there. There were some congregations, a couple of them, on the North Shore, just north of Boston, and they asked themselves, "Gee, what are our assets?" And the first asset of any congregation is its people. And then for congregations that have a building, they often say their building is their next asset. But what very few congregations realize is they also have land. And if you have land, you can plant a garden. And if you plant a garden, you can make it organic and sustainable. And you can learn about that and invite the community in to learn with you. And that becomes a whole sort of operation of learning and joy. And back to what you said earlier, Mary Evelyn, it can become a kind of a sacrament. The harvest can become a kind of sacrament. So I just wanted to get that out there as practical suggestions for congregations and clergy.
I love it. And I think John and I are part of a CSA in the town where we live in Woodbridge, and we're going to a dinner tonight to celebrate this CSA. And John, also, we have a garden in our home. And so I couldn't agree more about this point. And of course, supporting local farms and local farmers. And this is all over the world. And Vandana Shiva has made this extremely clear. I just also wanted to draw us back into the world's religions perspective and note a few things to supplement what Jim has just said. And Judaism with the kibbutz system and so on has had a very rich understanding of sustainable agriculture in a desert, and they've perfected irrigation, they've perfected purifying water systems and so on. And of course, that technology needs to be shared with the rest of the world. And there's a wonderful project called Eco-Peace Middle East that's trying to restore the Jordan River, bringing together the three traditions of the Abrahamic faiths, of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And, frankly, that whole region will not be sustainable without water, as will not the southwest of our country without water, and we go on and on. The issues of water, and Jim has noted this, are just extraordinary. But I also wanted to note that many of the Jewish leaders and rabbis themselves are vegetarian now. David Rosen and Arthur Green, and they have beautiful statements on why they are. I wanted to mention, as we all know, and give a real shout out to the Sikhs who do these magnificent feedings of people. We've been to their major temple up on the border of Pakistan and India, the Golden Temple, Amritsar, and to see the feeding that takes place there and all around the world, these langars, and the feeding is regardless of your religion, of your caste, your character, your gender. This generosity of Sikhs and feeding is, I think, just remarkable. And I want to call out the Jains, because those of you who may be vegetarian, but those who are vegan and maybe macrobiotic diets came really from the Jains, because the Jains said there are living presences in all of the natural world. And so the lower down on the food chain that we eat, the more we will protect life, and people will wear masks, not even to get insects in their mouth. They'll sweep the path to avoid insects. And they've created an astonishing diet that is very low in the food chain, as you know. Finally, the Confucian and Taoist traditions that I study in particular in East Asia, one of the things that motivated me enormously to do a thesis even that took years and years at Columbia, but it was this. It was the notion that in this Japanese Neo-Confucian 17th century thinker, but it goes way back to the early texts, that we have a filial relationship to heaven and to earth. That means like heaven, the cosmos is our father. This is the central teaching of Confucianism and Taoism too. Earth is our mother, and we are a small child in their midst. This is called the Western inscription. But therefore, our responsibility is to care for these systems as we would our own parents. So it's a magnificent sense of reciprocity that is filial piety, that is kinship oriented. And the lines that really inspired me early on for this work was, therefore, we cannot waste anything. We cannot chop down trees with negligence or and so on, and the way we treat birds. It's about moderation. Now, again, we remember all of these traditions have aspirations and then realizations, and they don't always match up. But I think we need to draw on this spectrum of ideas and actions around the world that are truly inspiring about our deepest relationality to the living systems in which we are embedded. And by coming back to these cosmological, earth-oriented understandings, then the food systems will arise in alignment with the cosmic powers of Earth and cosmos itself. I wanted to just also conclude here by saying, in these courses that we're doing on the world's religions and ecology that Coursera will have available for free, and this notion that food, water, animals is central, we will be highlighting. But there's a magnificent book called Religion and Sustainable Agriculture, World Spiritual Traditions and Food Ethics, which I highly recommend. And Vandana Shiva has the foreword here. But drawing on all over the world, I wish I could read you every title, but from the Amazon, Soil, Spirits, and Cosmocentric Economy, Renewal of Non-Western Methods for Sustainable Living, Nature, Spirituality, Sustainable Agriculture on the Big Island in Hawaii, drawing on indigenous practices there, Hindu traditions in peasant farming in the Himalaya foothills of Nepal, Gandhi's agrarian legacy, and Thailand's moral rice revolution. So these are amazing resources that bring in the cosmovisions, the worldviews, and the practices that people are recovering, renewing, and restoring. And that is very exciting. And I'll just conclude by saying this traditional environmental knowledge of indigenous peoples, but also of all the world's religions, married with good scientific knowledge and well-being as the measurements of the health of people and planet, this kind of new marriage will really be a basis, not just for sustainable agriculture, but for the flourishing of the ecosystems that sustain all of us. So thank you so much for being part of this.
So I just want to say to any clergy that's listening in on us before we sign off, if you could just in this recording, go back about 5 minutes and watch and listen to Mary Evelyn again, and take notes for your next 10 sermons. Because the reality is that from a source like Mary Evelyn, what we realize is there is so many resources available to us from the world's religions that have been gathered over millennia, and they are relevant now. As anybody who knows anything about me knows, I am a justice advocate. I am getting arrested. I am out there beating the drum. But what we need before we do that is to have that kind of background that fills up our soul and gives us the resolve to do what actually science says we need to in relation to climate change and in relation to transforming to a sustainable food system. So thank you for giving us this opportunity.
I love it. Just to say amen to that, Jim, it's the inspiration and perspiration, right? And we're so grateful for your activism. And believe me, my 60s activism is still with me. And that's why this synergy, isn't it, between ideas that inspire and the performance in protests and in planting. You know, how we plant ourselves, grow ourselves in the earth, with gratitude and reverence. So thanks, Jim. It was just fantastic being with you. I love it.
Likewise, Mary Evelyn. Thank you so much. It's been an honor.
Mm-hmm.